You know, I decided to entertain myself with a little bit of quality literature over the quarantine. Now, the wrestler Kurt Angle has a very famous catchphrase. He says, "Oh, it's true. It's damn true." The title of the book is It's True. It's True. What, they didn't want to put damn on the cover? Anyway, so we're going to talk about two things today. We're going to do a very basic just introduction to Mother Night. I'm going to give you some of the historical background on it, which honestly should be a little bit of the literary themes, get you thinking a little bit about what particular theorists would say about it. This is one of my favorite books. I love Mother Night. It's such a crazy, absolute psycho journey through like the modern mind. And it's really fun. I'm glad we're doing this as the novel. I used to do Game of Thrones. And as much as I love Game of Thrones, Mother Night is easier to read. It's just not as dense, but there's a lot of material to dig out of it. There's some really cool stuff in there. Now, let's talk a little bit about the research paper before we get into the book. Frankly, I want to make this easier as opposed to harder. So this is not going to be a very free research paper. You're not going to really be able to come in and write whatever you willy-nilly want. What I would like to do is I'd like to shoot for 6 pages, 3 sources. And I would like to do just a pure comparative reading of Mother Night and something else we've read in the semester. Mother Night, being a modern novel, is going to have all sorts of potential influences to it. And if it's not necessarily influenced by all the books, it's influenced and it's built of the same type of material that made those other stories and those other works, right? Modernity is a product of the past. And I think I've worked really hard this semester to talk a lot about American history and how history has informed the current mindset. Now we're at a point where we're trying to include everyone. We're trying to look at every perspective because we've also entered the era of globalism and post-colonialism, which means that we're actually trying to actively salvage narratives that have been left behind in the first place. Now, I think I'll open it up a little bit, and rather than just limiting this paper to talked about in class, if you want to go through your book and read some more stuff to try to find things that can connect to Mother Night, you can do that as well. If you want to go up, think about things, how characters are similar, how are themes similar, plot. It would, to really up the challenge level, would be to try to go for a couple of poems. And then to get on Galileo and look for information about the literature or about Mother Night that corroborates what you think, right? Now, if you go on Galileo and you try to find someone connecting Mother Night with Emily Dickinson, somebody may have done it, but it's not going to be an easy search. We don't have the near universal access to Galileo as many of the major universities do. So what you're probably going to want to do is go online and just look at what scholars are saying about individual pieces. What are they saying about Mother Night? What are they saying about Scarlet Letter? What are they saying about Nathaniel Hawthorne, Melville, T.S. Eliot, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is, it's going to be a very open thing, but you have to make those connections yourself. I don't want you thinking you can go on Galileo and find someone making those connections for you. Most of my students get really freaked out when they choose a topic and they don't find anything on Galileo that directly responds to the topic at hand. And they're like, "Mr. Bailey, I can't find anything that supports my idea." And I'm like, yeah, because it's a good idea. Did you really think that you were just going to be able to go online and find someone who agrees with you exactly? Now, in my experience in graduate school, said one of the easiest ways that you could pass a paper like this would be to find somebody who writes something clever and then just kind of find a way to shoehorn it into your opinion. That's not very genuine, and it shouldn't get a good grade, but it often does, because extenuating circumstances mean that it can be kind of hard for instructors to go back and evaluate for stuff like that, right? Really in-depth writing is not going to have someone directly saying the exact same thing. If anything, that actually makes it bad. Like, it's not original. You haven't put any real thought into it, right? So let me encourage you and say, if you don't find stuff that exactly matches what you're saying, that's a good thing. Like, you're going to have to put in a little bit of the intellectual legwork into creating those connections. That's something that should encourage you, right? So, like I said, next week I'm going to put up a nice, big, detailed mock-up of everything I'm expecting this paper, but that's generally what I'm looking for. The way we're going to handle this, I'm going to open a Dropbox like next week, maybe even Monday. I'm going to have it on unlimited submission, and you guys can submit to it as much as you want. I really don't care, okay? I'm going to be trying to grade these as much as I possibly can. I'm going to continue with the discussions. I'm actually going to start giving you a lot more points for the discussions so that you can, a lot of you guys are still struggling with reading quizzes. So we'll use the discussions to definitely round those out, all right? Now, it's so pretty outside today. I should try to get out. So, Mother Night. I think the reason I like Mother Night so much, I know we've talked about the literary theories. And literary theories I use them a lot to try to explain and model literary discourse and literary analysis. They're actually really not that good. If you were to go to graduate school, if you were to get a degree in English instruction, writing a purely theory-oriented paper isn't going to take you anywhere. You can rely a little bit on theory-oriented discussions. You can look for Marxist ideas. You can mention them. But for the most part, what you have to do is you have to craft an original kind of approach to something. You have to come up with an idea that has a little bit more of your personal interpretation to it. And so you got to be really careful if you rely on theory too much, but it's such a great way to introduce the concept. Now, I think every single literary person, maybe not scholar. I mean, I don't consider myself a scholar. I've had a few things published, but I consider myself more than anything else an existentialist. I talked to you guys a little bit about existentialism. It's an old theory. It's from France. It had kind of like a whole bunch of different starts and kind of like a lot of different iterations. But my branch of it is Sartrean existentialism. Is very French. The benefits of streaming live. So existentialism argues that existence precedes essence. Your essence is dependent upon the action of your existence. The things that you do, the choices you make, determine who you are. And it's not the other way around. There is no you outside of those choices and outside of those actions. So a lot of times in life, we appeal to our greater sense of self to try to help us negotiate things like moral decisions. What is the right thing to do? What is the good thing for me to, like, what is correct? What is moral? What would God want me to do? What would the universe want me to do? What is the proper way to act? And honestly, existentialism kind of bucks that, because for existentialism, trying to look to an outside system to determine your morality, to try to derive your value, is a huge no-no. Like, we should strive to be authentic as opposed to just being some other strange idealized version of self that doesn't exist. Dread and anxiety are something so pervasive. And Sartre argued that it was because we are all quite aware of how meaningless life is. Life does not come that you attribute to it. Now, this grew out of World War II. And Sartre's version of existentialism is a very morally obsessed one, but its interpretation of morality is very strange, because for Sartre, the authenticity of action is basically the equivalent of the moral action. And the big example of this for Sartre comes directly from his time in the French Resistance and the aftermath of the trials in Nuremberg. Now, to Nuremberg to be tried, right? These guys were basically the super villains of the ages. And the world called them to account for why they did what they did, right? Not only to account, but also to be executed. And this was kind of a way that the world kind of collectively looked and tried to understand what had transpired during the Holocaust. Now, you've probably heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. Genocide, really that long ago, that you would go to war with someone and you would just eradicate them when you beat them, because what else are you going to do, right? You're just going to leave them there to continue to be angry at you. The only reason you wouldn't completely burn down a civilization is if you had some type of avenue for trade with them. So, when you look back at American history, and again, this is one of those things that could potentially get me full of your own government history, but the American government was involved in some pretty nasty stuff especially when it was involved with Native Americans, wars that we fought with them, the way that we took land, we practically eradicated them, right? Well, when you look back, most people just did not have any sort of problem with straight up eradicating a group of people after they had been defeated. And there's a lot of writing that kind of preserves this attitude. There was one work, I can't remember who wrote it because I'm a terrible literature teacher, but it was called Manifest Destiny. And this whole thing basically was this big giant outline of how the white man had been favored by God and we had the right to do whatever the hell we wanted to do with this land and these people. So people would cite Manifest Destiny as, yeah, we can act like a bunch of jerks because we won the war and we can do whatever the hell we want. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because we look back on America's actions during that time period, but it's important to remember that's what everyone thought. That was basically the truth as it was assumed. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you excuse it, but it is quite fascinating when you look back at the aftermath of the Holocaust and the fact that now you look around and you ask people like, well, what about war crimes? Should we commit war crimes? Most people are going to be like, no, don't do that. That's bad. Go to war, but we conduct ourselves a certain way. We don't torture people. We don't, mass execute civilians. We don't do all these things. But before, that stuff just wasn't there. The idea of a war crime, how are you going to commit a crime during a war? It's a free for all. It's conflict, right? So, I mean, again, I really need to not be political, but you've probably noticed that this book is extremely mired in politics. When Donald Trump was running for president, one of the things that he advocated for is that he just didn't understand a lot of the stuff that we would designate as war crimes. And he was like, we're at war. Why would we want to not go after these people with all that we have? And this isn't to be critical of him, but a lot of people still don't see the logic behind limiting our capacity to be monsters. It's completely alien to us, right? So for humanity, and going back to Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialism, one of the most common excuses for Nazi war criminals, people who worked at the camps and people who were throwing the switches, the grunts, if you will, is that, if you are participating in such horror and we know that you were aware of what you were doing, why did you not object? Why did you continue to participate? Now, the answer to this is nauseatingly logical, but the answer usually was something along the lines of, it's not my fault. I was following orders. I was doing what I was told. That's one of the most important cornerstones for morality according to existentialism. Because that is one of the biggest examples of bad faith you can ever run into. Bad faith is basically self-deception, right? You're lying to yourself, deceiving yourself on the nature of your moral and individual choices, what you're responsible for. Now, a lot of people, when they hear this kind of weird thought experiment, they're going to say, well, they didn't have a choice. What else were they going to do? If obviously, if you don't throw the switch, if you stand up and say, no, I shouldn't do this, this is wrong, what are they going to do? They're probably going to throw you in the camp, right? Or they'll just, if in the terms of the later days of the war, they might just pull out a gun and shoot you right there, right? You're in fear for your life. So you are able to justify throwing that switch, right? I'm following orders. It's not my fault. It's not like I was organizing this whole crazy thing. But Sartre reacted to this with a kind of righteous rage. And what he said was, I think, very important. And let me kind of clarify this a little bit. Sartre basically said, yes, you did have a choice. And you made a choice. You could have chosen to die. You could have chosen to stand against this horror that surrounded you. And instead, you went along with it. You made the choice to accept it and to be a part of it. Therefore, we have every ground to condemn you just the same way that we condemn the ones who organized it, right? So, in a lot of ways, Sartre is right. You do have a choice. You can choose to lay down your life in defense of authenticity. Not authenticity, but in defense of your perception of the fact that what we're doing is the most horrifying thing that you can ever do as a human being, right? I will not participate in this. I will not be this. I will forfeit my existence because I won't do that, right? But there is another interesting avenue to this that might also be a way to authenticity, what's not as satisfying. It might just be in the way that you confess the crime and the way that you talk about the crime too. So think about this: if one of the workers of the death camps is up on the stand, they're like, "Why did you not?" Rather than say, "It's not my fault. I was just following orders." You could sit there and you could say, "Because I was a coward. Because I chose to value my existence over the lives of others. Because I'm not strong. Because I failed in my chance to be more than what I was." There's a lot of authenticity in that as well. I think the thing that angered Sartre the most was the fact that people were not only trying to survive during these trials when they had been cogs in the gigantic death machine, but what were they actually doing? They were trying to save face. They were trying to maintain some aspect of their pride. They were trying to throw their hands up in the air and say, "I'm still a good person," right? "I'm still a good person. I mean, yeah, I killed thousands of people by pressing a button, but I'm still a nice guy." No, you're not. No, you're not. And here's the thing too, like for most of you guys kind of know me from class that I try to be radically honest in some really, really stupid ways. I'm not a good person. I'm not. I do very selfish, outlandish, terrible, terrible things. I would say probably not much more than everyone else does. I kind of accept that selfishness as a part of my nature, right? I'm kind of a turd sometimes. I think we all have that capacity. That's the honesty, the authenticity that Sartre is looking for. Now, I can kind of maintain that right now because I'm just kind of teaching you about philosophical values. I'm not being tested. I don't have a gun to my head. There's my son. Hey, oh no. Come here, buddy. By the way, here's one guy who doesn't agree with that. Say hi.
Hi.
Now, I said none of us are good people.
That's a Buddy.
This is the exception. Is that Buddy?
Yeah, that's Buddy.
Is that our doggy?
Yeah, that's our doggy.
Oh, okay. All right, let me finish my class, okay?
Say over here.
Say bye-bye. You getting the book? Oh, go ahead, buddy. I love you. That was almost poetic, wasn't it? Oh, and this is a good. This is an example of goodness too. So they all wanted to come in and say hi. Yeah. So anyway, here's another example of authenticity, as Sartre may have outlined it. And then I'm just going to kind of give you a quick discussion question before we even start talking about the novel. How about this? Authenticity is also, right now, me saying, if I was put in a similar situation, and this is a risk, this is something that could get me in a lot of trouble, and I'm going to do it. If I was put in a similar situation with those guys working in the death camps, and I'd been there, and let's say somehow I'd managed to tell myself I was being willfully ignorant and this was just a temporary thing, and all of a sudden I find myself at the barrel of a gun being told that that if I don't push that button, I'm dead. I'm thinking about my family, thinking about all the stuff that goes into a question like that, a situation like that. There are all these thought problems that we use to kind of think about moral existence, about what's right and what's wrong. I think it's important for me to say, I don't know what I'd do. I'd really love to sit here and tell you that I would do the right thing and that I'd be authentic and I would lay my life down. But I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because human instinct, the will to self-preservation, is one of the single most powerful parts of our being when we encounter situations like that. And for someone to sit here and say, oh, no, I would not throw that lever, I would be a hero, is to detract from the power of people who actually would be under that situation and actually would, right? So authenticity is also to sit here and say, this is the right thing to do, but you know what? I don't know if I'd do it. I really, really don't know. I would like to think I wouldn't, but we all know what happens when we rely too much of how we would like to think about ourselves. We stop seeing ourselves realistically. Now, I haven't talked at all about Mother Night, which is kind of cool. I kind of like, this is the kind of framework you should put yourself into as you read this book, because one of the things that you'll notice as you read Mother Night is that there is nothing that tells us very much about who Howard Campbell Jr. actually is. He's kind of empty. He's kind of just this vacuous void. And he becomes basically what he needs to be in his surroundings. Now, for our discussion question, I want you to think a little bit about the thought experiment I've given you. I want you to think about going back to the operator of the death camp. And I will give you 100%, like, not immunity, but I'm not going to get mad at you. I want you to go to the discussion forum. I want you to tell me, do you think that we can blame the people who push the buttons or flip the switches or lock the doors? Do you think that we can blame those people as much as we can blame the architects? If so, or if not, why? Have a good weekend, y'all.